And a little later on, we're going to have Kate covering off 2 more chapters on our sermon series of the Book of Esther. So we'll be looking at more of Esther today. So I've got a reading that we're reading. I think this is, it's amazing how small the chapters are in Esther. So this is Esther, maybe also known as Ruth, I don't know. Only a couple of female names in the Old Testament, but it's Esther. So follow along on here while I read, or if you've got your Bibles with you, just please feel free to open those and follow along. So this is from Esther chapter 7. And again, Kate's going to be looking at chapter 7 and chapter 8. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet, and as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be granted." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favour with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" Esther said, "An adversary and enemy, this vile Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realising that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." The king said, "Impale him on it." So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. If you weren't awake before, you're hopefully awake now after that fairly dramatic turn of events. Not often you hear the word impaled in a Bible reading, so...
Morning, everybody. The first thing I need to say is a message from Greg, who said he was sorry that he misled you to think we were reading about Ruth, and he apologised for mixing up the good women of the Bible. Thank you. All right. Now, Esther. So, Esther, this book is full of so many scheming plots, revenge, genocide, questionable morality. It has characters with as much power, greed, selfish motivation as any Netflix special. Martin Luther apparently hated it and all its heathenish naughtiness and wished that it hadn't come to us. I've enjoyed Esther for the cleverness of the writing. Don't worry, you won't see all of those details. This comes from the Bible Project video, which is a really good explanation, but we'll come back to that. But the symmetry is highly pleasing, and Tim illustrated this in his overview talk, and like I said, it's laid out beautifully in this Bible Project snapshot from the video, where basically it sort of progresses down, flips, and then progresses back up in continual time after time. It's sort of mirrored and reflected and opposite. And all of this complexity, structure, and intrigue, and yet God is not mentioned once. In case you've not been around, this is the fourth of our sermons in Esther, And we've taken quite an in-depth look with only 2 chapters per sermon, so we've been able to really hone in on a few of the details of this little book. So here we are. The story of Esther is set in Susa, the capital of ancient Persia, in the place now known as Shush in Iran. Susa was actually founded in 4395 BC, and this is now thousands of years later. The Persian Empire is still thriving and indeed stretches from Egypt to India. Xerxes, the son of Darius, reigned from 486 to 465 BC. So that's 4,000 years later than when Susa began. He's known for raising the largest army in history recorded so far to that point for an unsuccessful invasion of Greece in 480 BC. Instead, apparently, he went on and focused on building an even bigger palace known as Persepolis. As I guess this gives some indication, Xerxes doesn't hold back in parading his wealth with lavish and extensive banquets. We start off with one that goes for 6 months. Nor does he hold back from getting drunk and then quickly making rash decisions. I'm not sure what you think of when you first think of Persia. If you didn't already know about Persepolis, you too may have thought of stone buildings, although maybe lit by torches on walls, some flimsy floors and lots of spikes, and little bottles that restore your health. Indeed, it was a brutal time, but also one of this incredibly rich and long history. So back to Esther, our characters today. So we've got King Xerxes, the extravagant king. We have Haman, the devious villain. He is the evil grand vizier of the empire. We've got Mordecai, the Jew, who won't bow down to Haman. And we have Esther, who won the beauty contest that was the search for a new queen. She's the new favourite of Xerxes, and she's just held her first banquet with him and the evil Haman. Haman is an Agagite, who is a descendant of King Agag. And so he was the king of the Amalekites, who were previously, some time ago, conquered by Saul, who was the Israelite king. So essentially, Haman comes from a very long line of enemies of Israel, with a grudge stretching back to the time of Exodus, so 500 years before. Just a little bit of the context of why he just hates Mordecai so much. Haman, this guy, having been buoyed by the invite to the first banquet, was then shamed by having to fulfill the delights he thought were going to be his reward, and instead had to apply all of this to Mordecai. This was last time. Again, he's spoken to his wife, who said, if this guy Mordecai is a Jew, in fact, your bad luck has only just begun. You don't stand a chance against him. You're as good as ruined. And at that point, the king's men had whisked him off to banquet number 2, which is where we begin. So our first chapter for today begins with a second banquet, at which Esther reveals her actual wish. Actually, that is the slide from Tim's sermon, because it was so similar. This is our version. So that was chapter 5, basically flipped around. We've got chapter 7, another banquet, almost the same text. But this time, she cleverly reveals that there is a plot not just against her, but also her people. So she says, if I have found favour with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. So she asks all of this of him without mentioning her Jewish heritage. And indeed, she hasn't mentioned it outside of to Mordecai, her sort of uncle, cousin figure. She hasn't mentioned it publicly to anyone for the whole story. So when she went to the palace for the beauty competition, as it were, Mordecai had told her not to mention anything about her family or her racial background. So the king still doesn't know she's Jewish. If he did, he would have been able to join up these dots about the threat against her and the plan that Haman had, and realise Haman is in fact the trouble here. So instead, he's startled and perplexed and then angry. Why? Who? Who would dare to threaten you, my queen, and your people? And so she still didn't elaborate until the king was well and truly curious, and in fact, furious that anyone should plot against his queen. And her careful words gradually made the story clearer. So she says, had been sold to be, and so have been sold is a phrase that's sometimes used for being handed over or betrayed, and she would have been making reference to the money that Haman had offered the king in the original setup of this edict. And then for destruction and slaughter and annihilation are again the same words mirrored from Haman's decree in chapter 3. And these words were in fact agreed to by Xerxes himself and signed off, albeit after a rather big banquet of drinking. The final part of verse 4 is a little bit less clear. She said, "If we had been merely sold as slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." It's a little bit hard to figure out. Perhaps if they were slaves, at least the king would have had free labour. Yeah. So anyway, Esther finally makes it clear. The evil Haman is the one out to get us. So Xerxes storms out of the banquet to clear his head, and Haman is rightly terrified. His scheme to not just kill Mordecai, but Mordecai's people, has unwittingly threatened the king's favourite wife, Esther. Seeing that he's just suddenly fallen from favour with the king, having moments before been the most trusted man to the king, he now stays inside with Esther. He falls at her feet. She is his only chance of survival, albeit a small one. He would have begged for mercy and forgiveness. We don't have his words here. Probably a jumbled garble of pleas. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to kill you. Just your people. I didn't know they were your people. You're not like them. I wouldn't want to kill you. I'll give you anything, everything. I'll give you my riches, my wealth. Just spare me. Would he have been prepared to part with his riches or renounce his hatred of the Jews? We don't get to find out, because Xerxes walks back in, sees him grovelling down, reaching out for her, and remembering that these banquets were on low chairs or cushions on the floor, so right down on the floor, maybe kissing her feet, and so Xerxes jumps to conclusions and accuses him of groping or more his queen. I suspect at this point that the king's rage was such that there was nothing that Esther could have done to save Haman, even if she had wanted to. So the next line said, as soon as the word left the king's mouth. So that's not linked to what Haman had just said about, now you're attacking my queen. It's literally the word habadah in the original text, which is a judicial sentence. So basically, as he said it, as soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And that's basically whisking him off to then kill him. And I've left out the part where basically then the way that they kill him is on the post that was prepared for Mordecai. So Haman had it all built, he had it ready for Mordecai, and then he is killed on it. Here we go, we come to that. So yes, there's 2 doses of irony here for Haman. So for Haman, who started this whole situation about edicts and Jews, and he was so desperate for Mordecai to bow down before him, and then he found himself at the feet of Esther the Jew. So one of these many reversals. And then, like I said, the evil that Haman had planned for the enemy instead fell onto Haman. Or he, in fact, fell onto it, depending on which translation. Some of them are a pole that you were impaled on, some of them it was hanged. Either way, it was bad news for Haman. So, where's one more bit? Sorry. So that's it. The king is dead. Sorry, the baddie is dead. The king and queen live happily ever after. Well, far from it. The villain is gone, but his mischief remains. The edict to kill the Jews is still in place, And it turns out that even the king can't undo an official edict. There's just one part I've lost. Hold on. Oh, here we go. I skipped it before. In terms of the word leaving the king's mouth. It's a succinct way of saying that the king pronounced the decree to execute Haman, and then the king calmed down. So this is a form of stress relief that we don't have access to. So at work, I often recommend taking a walk in nature, some mindfulness, maybe some conflict resolution strategies when you feel frustrated with someone. Xerxes says the word, and the problem is executed. So that's, yes, that was intrigued me. The king calms down. Much nicer, don't you think? All right. So, continuing on. Sorry, I didn't want to miss that slide. So the reversals continue in chapter 8. Xerxes, having been persuaded earlier in the book to sign the death warrant for basically all the Jews in the empire, is persuaded to instead help them. So first, he gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman. So how Haman would have hated yet another reversal. All of his wealth, significant, handed over to Esther. And then she handed over to Mordecai to manage. So it seems like as an executed criminal at that time, your estate was given to the king to do with whatever he felt. Doubly unfortunate for the women back in chapter 5 who had encouraged Haman to finish off Mordecai. They had said to him, "Oh yes, have a tower built about 22 metres high, and tomorrow morning ask the king to hang Mordecai there. Then later you can have dinner with the king and enjoy yourself." So it turned out that encouraging that pride did nobody any good. So Esther now explains to the king that Mordecai is her relative and what that connection is. The king gives Mordecai his signet ring, which he had retrieved from Haman. This now makes Mordecai one of the highest officials in the empire. Again, something like the Grand Vizier. So perhaps, maybe, not all Grand Viziers are evil. I thought they all were in all the stories. All right, so now we have yet another episode of falling at the feet of someone. This time it's not a humiliating reversal. It's just a show of Esther's great deal of emotion about the threatened fate of her people. So she begs at his feet, weeping. And Esther didn't stop with her own safety. The 13th day of the 12th month is coming, when that edict would come into place. And she is rightly terrified for her people, the whole of the Jewish people through the whole of the empire. So then the king extends his scepter to her. Previously, in chapters gone by, when he extended his scepter, he actually was demonstrating that he wouldn't kill her for daring to come and speak. This time it was probably more just an encouragement to stand up, to rise and speak. Possibly it was still the same time, it's not quite clear. As a side note, scepters aren't something we really think a great deal about these days. When we think about kings and queens, it's usually all about the crown. However, there is in fact a very long-standing tradition to have a rod representing the power of the monarch. I think it extends from Mesopotamian time, and that's a carving of Darius, who is the father of Xerxes, so preceding him with the rod, with the scepter. I noticed, in fact, that we got a glimpse of this sovereign scepter in some of the coverage of Queen Elizabeth's casket, in the many, many images we saw of that. And that one, having been used since 1661, actually is paired with the sovereign's orb, which is a gold sphere with a cross on top. And that, again, was brought into ceremony in 1661, and that signifies for the British monarch that the monarch is under God. Xerxes had no such orb. He was very much a king for himself. Anyway, now, back to chapter 8. So Esther had to be very diplomatic in the way that she presented her request to the king. The fate of the Jews literally rested on it. And Xerxes, this kind of reactive king has very sensitive feelings, and they're already hurt because Haman had tricked him. And Esther knew that if he was displeased, his mind could change in a moment. He had previously, chapter 1 I think, had made a law that his, at that stage, favourite wife Vashti could never see him again after she refused something, and even more had executed Haman there and then on the spot. So he's not to be trifled with. And he's feeling a little embarrassed. So she needs him to reverse the effects of this edict, which technically is impossible. The king is not allowed to reverse the edict. So instead, there has to be something put on top of it without making him look like a fool. So, careful territory. She manages to butter him up enough and put all the blame on Haman and not actually on the king himself. She says, "If it pleases the king," she said, "and if he regards me with favour and thinks it the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see destruction of my family?" And then, securing permission for her request, Xerxes suddenly is reminding Esther and Mordecai of all he'd done for the Jews. So he says, "Because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have hanged him on the gallows. Now write another decree in the king's name on behalf of the Jews as seems best to you." So Xerxes, the powerful but self-centered king, is now quickly giving himself credit for the change in prospects for the Jews, ignoring the fact that Esther pretty much brought it to his attention and made it happen. All right, the next verses go into the details for the writing and then distributing of this next decree. So obviously you don't have to read the words, but these two passages really closely mirror each other. But here the meaning is reversed, so that's the red parts are basically opposite. So we couldn't undo the decree, we needed another decree to sort of build on top of and counter the initial one. And in fact, now it doesn't just annul the first one. Now the Jews can actually destroy their enemies rather than be destroyed. So I think this one, the red bit is, this part is, the king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill and annihilate any armed force of any nationality or province that might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. So the key is the reversal from the Jews being killed to the Jews being able to defend themselves and retaliate. So the text almost matches, but it's the opposite. In fact, the reversal can be distilled even further. So Haman wrote an edict of death for the Jews, whereas by giving permission to kill their aggressors, Mordecai writes an edict of life for the Jews. And although distant history, this deliverance is actually relevant to us now. So without it, it's hard to see how the promises made to Abraham in Genesis about his descendants from all nations being blessed could have eventually come to being fulfilled through Jesus. And then the good news for all of us. So next, we see Mordecai leaving the palace in what can only be described as royal finery. Again, there is symmetry. In early Esther, the visual image was the extravagant King Xerxes in his palace, and now we see Mordecai being elevated, clothed as a king and celebrated. He was wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. So like I said, this echoed the finery in chapter 1, hangings of white and blue linen, cords of purple material, and couches of gold. But it was also the opposite of what was seen in the garb of despair in chapter 3, when things were looking terrible for Mordecai and his people. So finally, after the law was announced, the Jews were very happy and they felt they had won a victory. In every province and city where the law was sent, the Jews had parties and celebrated. In the Message version, It says, for the Jews, it was all sunshine and laughter. They celebrated and they were honoured. Just yesterday, Astrid was making a potion, pouring things for endless sunshine and singing, cover me in sunshine. And I just loved the little image, while I was obviously thinking about this work, of all the goodness and the joy that the Jews were feeling covered in sunshine, cheering and feasting. So, all of this intense story, full of so many reversals. Haman meets his fate, Esther saves the day, Mordecai is greatly rewarded. What does it mean for us? So, this whole story occurs while God's people are foreigners, having been exiled and not all returning. God seems to be absent from the story at first. I mean, he's not mentioned, but looking more, his hand can be seen in events both big and small. So many of the interactions can be seen to be guided by God, even with the protagonist placed just so. So in chapter 4, Mordecai reminded Esther that she has a purpose. Although at first she was unsure about taking the risk, he said to her, and who knows but that you have come to your royal position for a time such as this? So God works in all sorts of ways. Some are actually small but significant moments, which could be seen as coincidences or just so moments. So it just so happened that Mordecai, who offended Haman by not bowing, has a beautiful relative, Esther, who he is raising. It just so happened that the king's eunuchs took a liking to Esther and she won the beauty contest to be the next queen. It just so happened that Mordecai heard about the plot to kill the king so he could foil it. And then it just so happened that the king couldn't sleep and had the story about Mordecai saving him read to him that night, right when Haman was wanting to kill Mordecai. So many things that were seemingly left to chance, in fact, were guided by God. And we can look again at each of the characters. They've got their all almost over the top emphasized goodness and badness. Xerxes, despite his apparent power, is easily influenced and weak. Haman tricks him. And then, despite making the edict that men will be in charge of their wives, Esther competently engineers their interactions and secures the result she hoped for. He has his eyes on material things. At the banquets, when Esther asks what she does, he asks Esther what she might desire, he offers what she thinks he might like. Almost anything that she could have, up to half his kingdom. Assuming that's exactly what she would want. Haman is evil and arrogant, prideful but cowardly, hungry for glory. All of his power, and yet he isn't satisfied. He cannot bear that Mordecai will not bow down to him. Perhaps this is a reminder that the approval of men is never enough. Only Jesus can really satisfy our hearts. So he masterminded the planned massacre and the planned death of Mordecai, but then he himself was killed by the plan, and his sons go on to be killed by the Jews. Mordecai, the Jew, solid, faithful, sane and godly. Although he's not perfect, he didn't set out to get the power that he ended up with. Although soaked in a fairly heathen time, for the main part, he's faithful. Esther, the young, orphaned, and as it turns out, ravishing cousin of Mordecai, through her words and actions, God shows that God's people will not be eliminated. They will instead continue and fulfill the promises of long ago, that Jesus will be a saviour not just for Jews, but for all nations. So she uses the moments presented to her and the gifts that she has of beauty and a skillful way of words. Her heart is not focused on material things that Xerxes offers her. She seeks only the safety of her people, and she will risk everything for them, including her own life. She requires significant strength of character. She needs patience, For a whole year, she was in the harem waiting for the beauty contest before getting to meet the king and become the queen. And then even more patience when she goes to meet Xerxes, but she doesn't launch straight into her case. She invites him for not one, but 2 banquets, biding her time. And she has been obedient, highlighted especially earlier in Esther when she carefully follows Mordecai's instructions. She requires every ounce of emotional intelligence that she has to deal with this volatile character of Xerxes. The threat of death for an enormous number of Jews weighs on her, and yet she approaches Xerxes with a plan, not in a desperate frenzy. Her leadership reminds us that being a leader is not about what you can gain, but being willing to sacrifice and give of yourself in order for the good of the people. These are qualities to be nurtured: patience, obedience, careful communication, and to be used for good, as Esther did. These are qualities that reflect Jesus, not that she knew that at the time. The book definitely doesn't give us tips for intimate relationships. Esther has to risk death to enter the king's presence. She hides a huge part of her identity, her whole Jewishness, and she has to be so very particular with her communication. It sounds like a nightmare. And we can't learn problem solving from Xerxes. Kill whoever bothers you and take advice from anyone who catches your ear. Despite this, despite the brokenness of these characters, God works through all of them. He continues the Jewish people, bringing them through this time to the moment when Jesus will enter the world. He has a plan for everyone and would like people to participate in his plans. But even through disobedience and personal failures, God shows us he can still do his work. At times, it is strange, definitely ironic, and can be difficult to see. So this story is full of so many reversals and upheavals. And this reminded me that God's kingdom is full of reversal also. The weak shall be strong, the poor shall be rich, the first shall be last. And our Saviour Jesus arrived unexpectedly, weak and poor, and came to glory by being obedient to the Father and then crucified. I'm going to pray. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for the words that we have in Esther. Thank you for the pleasure that we can take in the crafted words, for the examples of obedience, patience, and emotional intelligence. Thank you that you continue your plan even when the characters are getting things so clearly wrong. Thank you that you are there in the story even when your name isn't mentioned. Please be with us when we feel like you're not here, and work in us as we try to follow your ways, but so often don't get it right. Amen. Thank you.